A train line once promised to change the world. Instead, it destroyed an empire and reshaped the Middle East forever. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. What you're about to learn changes everything you thought you knew about World War I. They teach you a story in school. A story about an assassination, 2 bullets, 1 archduke. A tragic accident that spiraled out of control. They tell you it was about alliances, honor, and miscalculation. But that story? It's a lie designed for children. A sanitized version that hides the real engine of history: money, power, control. If you want to understand why millions drowned in mud and blood, why the map of the Middle East is a jigsaw puzzle of broken nations, why oil became the most valuable substance on earth, you need to forget the archduke. You need to look at something far more dangerous. Not a weapon, not an army, a railway. This is the story of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. An iron road that promised to connect the industrial heart of Europe to the oil-soaked deserts of Mesopotamia. A mega project that threatened to shatter British dominance and rewrite the rules of global power. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, drowning in debt and humiliation, tried one last desperate gamble to break free from financial slavery, and how that gamble sealed their destruction. To understand this tragedy, you must first see the world as it existed at the dawn of the 20th century. The year is 1900. The British Empire is the undisputed master of the planet. 1/4 of all land, 1/4 of all people. An empire on which the sun never set. Their power rested on 2 iron pillars. The first, the Royal Navy, the most powerful military force ever assembled. They controlled every major shipping lane, every ocean passage, every critical waterway. If you wanted to trade across the seas, you sailed under the shadow of British guns. The second pillar, the Suez Canal. Carved through the Egyptian desert, this narrow strip of water was the jugular vein of empire. It was the only fast route from Europe to India, the crown jewel, the golden goose that made Britain unimaginably wealthy. As long as Britain controlled Suez, they controlled who could reach the east. If you were a German industrialist, a Russian merchant, an American trader, and you wanted to do business with India, China, or Southeast Asia, you had no choice. You passed through British checkpoints. You paid British tariffs. You played by British rules. It was extortion dressed up as civilization. But in the heart of Europe, something was stirring. Germany, unified only in 1871. This new nation was rising like a furnace. German factories outproduced British factories. German chemistry revolutionized the world. German engineering became legendary. But Germany had a fatal problem. No empire. No vast colonial territories to extract rubber, cotton, gold, or oil. And worst of all, no navy capable of challenging British supremacy. Germany was a giant, trapped in the center of Europe, surrounded by rivals, cut off from global markets by British steel and British guns. They were suffocating. And to the southeast, another giant was dying: the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, they had been a superpower that stretched from Vienna to Yemen, from Algeria to Baghdad. But by the late 1800s, they were known by a different name. The sick man of Europe. The empire was rotting. Territory lost in the Balkans. An outdated military. Corrupt bureaucracy. But the greatest wound was invisible. Debt. Crushing. Suffocating, unrepayable debt. The Ottoman government owed staggering sums to British and French banks. In 1881, they went bankrupt, completely insolvent. To satisfy their creditors, they were forced into a humiliating surrender. They handed control of their own economy to a foreign institution called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This wasn't a loan restructuring. This was financial colonization. European bankers literally collected taxes from Ottoman citizens. If a Turkish farmer sold salt, tobacco, or silk, the money didn't go to Constantinople. It went to a vault in London or Paris. The Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, watched his empire being devoured from the inside. He understood what was happening. This wasn't just economics, this was slow-motion conquest. The British and French didn't need to invade. They owned the country through paperwork. The Sultan was desperate. He needed infrastructure, roads, telegraphs, railways. He needed to move troops from the capital to the desert frontiers in days instead of months. He needed to modernize his military and economy fast. But here was the trap. If he asked Britain or France to build that infrastructure, they would use it to tighten the noose. They would gain even more control. He needed help from someone else. someone with no colonial presence in Ottoman lands. Someone who wanted what the British wanted: power. Enter Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, ambitious, paranoid, brilliant. He saw what the Sultan needed, and he saw an opportunity that could reshape the world. What if Germany could build a railway? Not just any railway, a continental land bridge. Berlin to Constantinople, Constantinople to Baghdad, Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. Think about the geometry of this vision. A train loaded with German steel, chemicals, weapons, and machinery could leave Berlin, roll through Vienna, cross the Balkans, enter Ottoman territory, and travel all the way to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, without ever encountering a British warship. Without ever passing through the Suez Canal. It would create a massive overland trade corridor that the Royal Navy couldn't touch. It would unite German industrial might with the vast natural resources of the Middle East. For the Sultan, it was a lifeline, a chance to escape the grip of London and Paris. For Germany, it was a path to world power. For Britain, it was an existential nightmare. Construction began in the 1890s, German financing, German engineers. Deutsche Bank, the colossal German financial institution, took the lead. The engineering was miraculous for its time. They blasted tunnels through the Taurus Mountains. They laid tracks across scorching deserts where men died from heat and thirst. They built bridges over rivers that flooded without warning. As the tracks inched eastward, year by year, panic began to ripple through the halls of power in London. British strategic planners stared at maps late into the night. They saw a dagger pointed directly at the heart of their empire. If this railway was completed, German troops could threaten the Suez Canal. German merchants could flood Indian markets with cheap manufactured goods. The monopoly would be broken. But there was something else. Something even more dangerous than trade: oil. At the turn of the century, the world was changing fuel. Coal had powered the Industrial Revolution. But oil was the future. The British Royal Navy had discovered that oil burned hotter and cleaner than coal. Ships powered by oil could travel faster, stay at sea longer, and required smaller crews. Admiral John Fisher, the ruthless architect of British naval supremacy, famously declared, "The fleet must convert to oil or die." But Britain had a problem. There was no oil on the British Isles. They relied on imports from Persia and the United States. And geologists were beginning to whisper something extraordinary. The land the Baghdad Railway would cross, the ancient territory of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, was sitting on an ocean of oil. Vast reserves. Unimaginable wealth. And the Germans had secured the mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the railway tracks. This meant one thing: if the railway was completed, Germany would control the tap. They would control the fuel supply for the future of naval warfare. They would control the substance that the British Navy needed to survive. This was unacceptable. The British establishment made a decision. This railway could not be allowed to reach the sea. They deployed every weapon in their arsenal. First, diplomacy. They pressured the Sheikh of Kuwait, a small territory at the southern end of the proposed route, to sign a secret treaty. The Sheikh agreed not to lease any land to foreign powers without British approval. It was a strategic checkmate. The railway now led to nowhere. No access to the Persian Gulf. No port. No connection to global shipping lanes. Second, propaganda. British newspapers launched a relentless campaign. They painted the Ottoman Empire as barbaric, backwards, oppressive. They accused the Germans of supporting tyranny and threatening European civilization. The railway was no longer described as infrastructure. It was portrayed as a tool of German imperial aggression. Third, finance. The City of London, the beating heart of global capital, refused to allow any British investment in the project. They tried to starve it of money. But the Germans kept building. By 1914, the tracks had reached the mountains of southern Turkey. The project was nearly complete. The threat was becoming real. It is in this context, this powder keg of economic rivalry and strategic paranoia, that we must view the outbreak of World War I. The tensions between the great powers were not just about nationalism or honor. They were about who would control the economic arteries of the future. The Triple Entente, the alliance of Britain, France, and Russia, was formed specifically to encircle Germany and crush its ambitions. Russia feared the railway would strengthen the Ottomans, whom they desperately wanted to destroy and partition. France feared German economic dominance on the continent. Britain feared for India, for Suez, and for the oil that would power the 20th century. When the war erupted in August 1914, the first place the British military looked wasn't Berlin. It was the Middle East. The tragedy for the Ottoman Empire was complete. They had tried to use European rivalry to save themselves. Instead, they were about to be crushed between the gears of empires. The Ottomans made their choice. They joined the war on the side of Germany. It seemed logical. A German victory would free them from their crushing debts to Britain and France. The railway would bring German weapons, German supplies, German reinforcements to help them reconquer lost territories in Egypt and the Caucasus. They believed Germany would win. They believed the railway would be their salvation. But they had miscalculated. They had underestimated the ruthless, cold-blooded determination of the British Empire. The British weren't fighting just to defeat an army. They were fighting to secure an asset. The most valuable asset in the modern world: oil. As soon as war was declared, a British expeditionary force was dispatched to Basra in southern Iraq. Officially, their mission was to protect the oil refinery at Abadan. But their real objective was far more ambitious. They were marching north, following the path of the unfinished railway, moving to seize the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before German engineers could reach them. This wasn't a defensive operation. This was a land grab disguised as military necessity. The war in the Middle East was brutal beyond imagination. While soldiers in Europe drowned in mud and poison gas, soldiers in Mesopotamia died of heat stroke, dysentery, and dehydration. The desert showed no mercy. Water was scarce. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Men went mad from thirst and fever. The British suffered humiliating defeats. At the Siege of Kut in 1916, an entire British army was surrounded and starved into submission. 13,000 British and Indian soldiers surrendered to the Ottomans. It was one of the worst defeats in British military history. But the British Empire had something the Ottomans didn't: unlimited resources, unlimited manpower, unlimited industrial capacity. The Ottomans were running on empty. And the railway? The railway that was supposed to save them was still incomplete. There were gaps in the tracks through the mountain passes. Critical sections remained unfinished. Supplies from Germany had to be unloaded from trains, carried by truck or camel over the mountains, then reloaded onto different trains on the other side. This bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort. Imagine the bitter irony. If the railway had been finished just 5 years earlier, the entire war might have unfolded differently. German troops and supplies could have poured into the Middle East. The Ottomans could have been reinforced quickly. The British advance could have been stopped. But the gaps in the tracks were like severed arteries. The empire bled out. The inability to move troops and supplies fast enough allowed the British to regroup, reinforce, and push forward. City by city, mile by mile. Eventually, they captured Baghdad in March 1917, then Jerusalem in December 1917. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing. But even as the war raged, something sinister was happening in secret. British and French diplomats were meeting in private rooms, drawing lines on maps, dividing territory that didn't belong to them. They didn't wait for the war to end. In 1916, two men sat down with a map and a pencil. Mark Sykes from Britain, François-Georges Picot from France. They drew lines across the Middle East, lines that ignored tribal boundaries, lines that ignored religious sects, lines that ignored rivers, mountains, and centuries of human geography. But if you study the Sykes-Picot Agreement closely, something chilling becomes clear. The lines they drew correspond almost perfectly to the proposed route of the Baghdad Railway, and to the known locations of oil deposits. Britain claimed southern Iraq and the port of Haifa in Palestine. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving up the carcass of an empire that hadn't even died yet. They were dividing the spoils to ensure that no single power could ever again threaten their dominance. The railway that was meant to unite the region became the knife that divided it. And the betrayal? The betrayal was total. The Arabs had been promised independence. British agents, most famously T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, had encouraged Arab tribes to revolt against Ottoman rule. They blew up railway tracks. They sabotaged trains. They attacked Ottoman supply lines. Lawrence promised them freedom. He promised them their own nation. But when the war ended, the Arabs didn't get independence. They got British colonial governors in Iraq, French colonial governors in Syria, borders drawn by foreigners, puppet kings installed by Europe. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved. The Sultan was deposed and exiled. The caliphate, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was abolished, and the debt? The crushing debt that started this whole nightmare? It wasn't forgiven. It was merely restructured. The new nations carved out of Ottoman territory inherited the debt. They would spend decades paying it back. The British Empire had succeeded. They had stopped the German threat. They had secured the route to India. And most importantly, they had seized control of the oil that would power the entire 20th century. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was cut into pieces. Different sections now belonged to Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. 3 different countries, 3 different governments, 3 different customs systems. It never functioned as the unified trade route it was designed to be. The dream of a Silk Road made of steel was dead, destroyed. But the destruction didn't end in 1918. The ghost of that railway continued to haunt the Middle East for decades. And it has returned with a terrifying vengeance in the 21st century. After World War I, Britain and France controlled the Middle East. But they had a problem. They had seized the land. They had seized the oil. But they still needed to get that oil back to Europe. The Baghdad Railway, which had caused so much fear, was now in their hands. But it was broken, fragmented, useless. The borders they had deliberately drawn created new obstacles. A train traveling from Baghdad to Europe now had to cross 3 different customs borders, deal with 3 different currencies, navigate 3 different colonial administrations. The economic unity of the region was shattered, and this was intentional. The colonial powers preferred a divided Middle East, weak, dependent, easy to control. A united Middle East could challenge them, could demand fair prices for oil, could build its own industries. That was unacceptable. In the years following the war, the British focused on building pipelines instead of railways. Pipelines were easier to control. They didn't carry passengers. They didn't carry ideas. They didn't carry movements or revolutions, only oil. The Iraq Petroleum Company was formed, a consortium of British, French, and American oil giants. They built a pipeline from the oil fields of Kirkuk in Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean coast. This pipeline followed almost the exact same strategic logic as the old railway project. But this time, the profits flowed exclusively westward. The people of the Middle East watched their wealth being pumped out of the ground and shipped away, while their own infrastructure remained primitive, their schools underfunded, their hospitals inadequate. The dream of modernization that the Ottoman sultans had envisioned was replaced by a brutal reality: extraction. The West took everything and gave back almost nothing. But the strategic concept of the Baghdad Railway never truly died. The idea of a land bridge connecting Europe and Asia is simply too powerful to ignore. Geography doesn't change. During the Second World War, the railway became a focal point once again. Nazi Germany, just like Imperial Germany before it, looked eastward. Hitler dreamed of accessing the oil fields of Iraq and the Caucasus. German intelligence agents were sent to Iraq to stir up rebellion against the British. They promised to finish what Kaiser Wilhelm had started. They promised Arab independence. They promised German support. And once again, the British had to invade Iraq to secure the oil fields and the transport routes. In 1941, British forces overthrew the pro-German government in Baghdad. It was history repeating itself, almost word for word. The locations of the battles changed slightly, but the prize remained exactly the same. Control the corridor. Control the world. After the Second World War, the British Empire finally collapsed under the weight of its own debts. Exhausted, bankrupt, broken, the United States stepped in to fill the void. The Americans inherited the British obsession with controlling the Middle East, but they used different methods. Instead of direct colonial rule, they used coups, secret operations, military alliances, puppet governments. But the fear was the same. The Americans were just as terrified as the British had been of a rival power dominating the Eurasian landmass. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union became the new boogeyman. The Americans feared Soviet tanks pouring through the same mountain passes the Baghdad Railway had once traversed. Turkey became a crucial NATO ally. Not because of democracy, not because of shared values, but because Turkey sat on the most strategically valuable real estate in the world. The choke point between East and West, the bridge between Europe and Asia, the same land the railway had crossed. Now fast forward to December 2025. Today, right now, The parallels between the era of the Baghdad Railway and our current moment are absolutely terrifying. We are living through the same pattern, the same rivalry, the same fears. Today, we have a new rising industrial power challenging the dominant naval empire. China is the new Germany. The United States is the new British Empire. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway. Look at the strategic logic. It's identical. Just like Kaiser Wilhelm over a century ago, the Chinese leadership understands they are vulnerable at sea. The US Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In the event of war, America could blockade China and strangle its economy. Cut off oil from the Middle East. Cut off trade with Europe. Starve the Chinese economy into submission. So what is China doing? Exactly what Germany tried to do. Building massive infrastructure projects across the Eurasian continent. High-speed rail lines, pipelines, highways, ports, all designed to connect China to Europe and the Middle East overland. Look at a map of the Belt and Road Initiative. Study it carefully. It looks almost exactly like the map of the Baghdad Railway, but on a much larger scale. It seeks to bypass the choke points controlled by the American Navy, the Straits of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz. It seeks to unite the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East into a single integrated trading bloc. A bloc that excludes the United States. And just like the British in 1900, the Americans are panicking. We see the same headlines in newspapers today. They call Chinese infrastructure projects debt traps. They accuse China of supporting dictators. They try to block Chinese companies from buying ports and building 5G networks in allied countries. The language has barely changed in over 100 years. The strategic anxiety is identical. The fear is the same. A rival power building a land route that bypasses naval dominance. The story of the Baghdad Railway teaches us a dark lesson. When a declining empire feels threatened by an infrastructure project that could undermine its hegemony, it will lash out. It will use financial warfare, sanctions, propaganda, sabotage, and eventually, if necessary, military force to stop the connection from being made. The Middle East is once again the chessboard where this great game is being played. The wars in Iraq, the destruction of Syria, the tensions with Iran, the instability in Turkey. All of these conflicts are happening along the exact same fault lines where the railway tracks were laid over a century ago. This is not a coincidence. This is geography. This is strategy. This is the cold mathematics of empire. We can look at the tragedy of the Ottoman Empire as a warning for nations today. The Ottomans thought they could play the European powers against each other. They thought they could take German money to build infrastructure while maintaining their independence. But when you invite a superpower to build your critical infrastructure, you're not just buying steel and concrete. You're importing their geopolitical enemies. You're painting a target on your own land. The train that was supposed to bring prosperity brought armies instead. Armies that tore the empire into pieces. Today, right now, many developing nations are facing the same impossible choice the Sultan faced. They desperately need development, bridges, roads, high-speed rail, power plants, hospitals, schools. China offers to build them, cheap, fast, with no lectures about human rights or democracy. The West warns them to stay away, threatens sanctions, threatens aid cuts. These nations are caught in the middle of a struggle that's far bigger than them. And the lesson of the Baghdad Railway is brutal and clear. Infrastructure is never neutral. A road is never just a road. A railway is never just a railway. It is a vector of power. It is a strategic asset. And the powers that be will burn the world down before they let their rivals control the flow of trade. As we watch the news today and see chaos erupting across the Middle East, we're often told it's about religion. Ancient hatreds, Sunni versus Shia, Arab versus Persian. We're told it's a clash of civilizations. But if you dig down through the sand and the blood and the history, you hit something solid. You hit the rusted iron tracks of a German railway that was never finished. You find the remnants of a business deal that went catastrophically wrong. You find proof that the borders of the Middle East were not drawn to create functional nations. They were drawn to stop a train. The world we live in today, the wars we fight, the prices we pay at the gas station, the terrorism, the refugees, the instability, all of it was shaped by the failure of the Baghdad Railway. The train that never arrived is still destroying the world. The empire that tried to escape slavery was dismembered for trying, and the pattern is repeating right now, in real time, before our eyes. I'm John. This is Cinematic History Tales. If you've made it this far, you understand something most people will never see. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. Subscribe right now if you want to stay ahead of what's coming. Because when the history books are written about this decade, about 2026 and beyond, you'll want to be among the few who saw the pattern. Empires don't collapse the way people expect. They collapse the way people ignore. The signs are always there. The railway, the trade route, the infrastructure project that threatens the old order. If you recognize these patterns playing out somewhere else today, you already know what comes next. The question is whether anyone will stop it this time. Or whether we're doomed to watch another empire torn apart, another region set on fire, all because a rising power tried to build a road. If you think this documentary is wrong, leave a comment and explain where. If you think it's right, leave a comment and explain why. Either way, history is written by those who argue it, those who question it, those who refuse to accept the sanitized version they teach in schools. I'll be reading every single comment. If you want to see the next empire unravel before your eyes in real time, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Because only those who pay attention learn what history deliberately hides. The truth is never in the textbooks. It's in the railway lines that were never completed. The treaties signed in secret. The oil buried beneath the sand. Stay sharp, stay awake, and I'll see you in the next one.